For a thrill-seeking boy in need of a good read, here it is.
To Senor Fenton Hardy, private detective from United States. This is to warn you and your sons that you must not set foot upon Mexican soil. If you disregard this warning, there will be one penalty, and that penalty will be death.
What red-blooded American kid could ever put down a book that starts like that? Perhaps no other writer knew this simple truth better than Edward Stratemeyer, who transformed children's literature and turned an entire industry on its ear.
Stratemeyer came along at a time when a lot of influences converged to make him not just at the right place at the right time, but having the right ideas at the right place at the right time.
Here's a man who really understood kids. It didn't matter if they were boys or girls, young or old. He really had his finger on the pulse of what appealed to kids.
Tom Swift, the Hardy Boys, Nancy Drew. Their adventures have played out in hundreds of millions of books, printed without pause for the better part of a century. And while their creator is one of the most published writers ever and his heroes world-renowned, almost no one knows his name. America, 1910. It was a new era, full of boundless optimism and unwavering faith in technology. Inventors were the heroes of the day. Henry Ford, Thomas Edison, the Wright brothers. And for millions of wide-eyed young readers, boy inventor Tom Swift. Sprung from the pages of Edward Stratemeyer's latest series book for boys, Tom was a poster child for American ingenuity. But it was his on-the-go independence, according to Stratemeyer, that truly hooked his readers in.
A wide-awake lad has no patience for that which is namby-pamby. He demands real flesh-and-blood heroes who do something.
The phrase wide-awake boys and girls is really critical to understanding the work of Edward Stratemeyer. In his books, children are awake, they're living in the world, they are having adventure, they're grabbing the world really by the neck and enjoying it to its fullest extent.
Tom Swift and his motorcycle roared into an era marked not only by new technology, but social progress too. By the turn of the century, labor reforms had moved children out of fields and factories into schools. The notion of adolescence was born, making childhood longer. For the first time in history, children had freedom, autonomy, and the chance to enjoy it. Kids were finally kids. And when they demanded entertainment, Stratemeyer's books were there to satisfy. Inspiration for Stratemeyer's 20th century page-turners came from the stories he himself had read on the sly as a boy. The thrilling but disreputable adventures of Deadwood Dick, Deadshot Dave, and Jesse James, heroes of the illicit dime novel.
Dime novels were cheaply produced, quickly written, blood and thunder adventure stories, made mainly for adults. They were not initially children's books. Gradually, they became more and more popular with children because they were inexpensive and because they kind of had that lure of the forbidden.
Deadshot Dave finds himself embroiled in 1 dogfight, 4 confidence games, 2 robberies, 2 kidnappings, 8 fistfights, 2 stabbings, and 5 shootings, 3 of them fatal. All this in a story 14 pages long. Naturally, kids loved them. Dimes had no greater fan than young Edward Stratemeyer, who was scribbling out his first stories when still wearing knee breeches. By 15, Stratemeyer was doling out fiction to several amateur weeklies, including his own, The Young American, published by Edward himself on a toy printing press in the attic of his home. The budding writer had found his calling. For the next 2 decades, by day, night, and in every spare moment, Stratemeyer wrote. When marrying time came, fellow writer Mattie Van Camp joined his side. 2 daughters later, it was a family affair, with Mattie helping type manuscripts as the girls tested father's plots in the form of bedtime stories.
His imagination was boundless. His daughter can remember him, even on holiday, suddenly leaping to his feet and rushing back to their room when they were at the seaside, because he had to write the plot down before he forgot it. He was just, I don't know, it was almost an obsession with him, as if he couldn't stop it.
From dimes to serials to historical romances and newspapers, Stratemeyer wrote so much, publishers asked him to start using pen names. This to hide that so much of what they were publishing was written by just one man. Ed Ward, Arthur M. Winfield, Edna Winfield, Captain Ralph Bone Hill. Under these and other pen names, Stratemeyer wrote his pencil to a nub.
I think that early experience helped him enormously in figuring out what kinds of things appealed to kids. They may change over time, but mostly kids run in packs, and he understood that.
The rough and tumble world of dimes and cheap serial novels had honed Stratemeyer's skills. World events would give him the means to use them. On May 1st, 1898, Admiral Dewey and his naval squadron trounced the Spaniards in a decisive victory of the Spanish-American War. Hopped up on a strong dose of patriotism, the nation gobbled newspaper and film accounts of their boys' success. Eager to capitalize on the frenzy, a publisher of respectable juvenile literature enlisted Stratemeyer's help. Under Dewey at Manila was on the shelves 5 weeks later, before even Dewey himself had returned for his hero's welcome. The ripped from the headlines war tale was an instant sensation, and the publisher promptly called for more. Stratemeyer delivered again, and the Old Glory series swelled and soared. The dime novel hack had crossed the threshold. Reputable publishers began banging down his door. From the Rover Boys to Shorthand Tom, Dave Dashaway, the Motor Boys, and Baseball Joe, Stratemeyer was on a tear.
He wasn't an innovator in the sense of coming up with completely unique ideas, as he was a person who just had a good sense of how to capitalize on trends that were already possible. He wrote the frontier heroes. He wrote the military heroes. He wrote the boys going out to the goldfields kind of books.
And whatever Stratemeyer wrote, kids seemed to just eat up. But while the writer in him was pleased he'd found an audience, Stratemeyer the businessman wanted to sell even more books. So in a plan hatched with his publishers, he made a move as radical as it was simple. Slash book prices in half. The scheme hinged on one factor: massive volume in sales. It was the great 50-center gamble, and Stratemeyer rolled the dice. Within a week, Fortune magazine reported that the Motor Boys had broken out upon the country like measles.
To sell the books for 50 cents each, I think was just a piece of genius in terms of marketing. It did have some librarians and educators and others decrying them as being cheap, both in terms of content and form, but it meant that kids could possibly buy them themselves.
He was aware of his competition. He was pricing against his competition. And it's rare to have that combination of skills: author, merchant, marketer, salesperson, all wrapped up in one person.
But no matter how many hats he wore or pen names he assumed, Stratemeyer was still just one person.
The books were becoming more and more popular, and the publishers were demanding more and more of them, and he just couldn't write them all himself.
Writing a dozen series under as many different names, Stratemeyer had reached his limit. It was then that he hit on the true brilliance of pseudonyms. If his readers didn't know he was writing under the names, they also wouldn't know if he wasn't. As ads for ghostwriters were placed nationwide, Stratemeyer drew the veil behind which he'd build an empire.
Many of the ghostwriters never actually met Edward Stratemeyer. He was very careful to keep everybody separated, and he was very adamant in his advertisement that everything was to be by mail only. He didn't like to meet them.
Working from Stratemeyer's 3-page outlines, ghostwriters had 30 days to produce a book. Finished manuscripts were mailed back to Stratemeyer, polished to his satisfaction, and promptly handed to the publisher under his pseudonym of choice. In no time, a small army of ghostwriters was under his employ, churning out book after book after book. The Stratemeyer Syndicate was born.
The idea of a fiction factory seemed to fit in very well with the times. The idea of mechanism, of streamlining being the way to approach everything. In the case of the Model T, it produced absolutely cookie-cutter reliability that people could count on, and I think that Stratemeyer's books offered that same kind of comforting familiarity.
Familiarity was at the core of the Stratemeyer formula, a set of hard and fast rules dictating exactly how his books were to be written.
First, every page, if it could be done, should be left with details that forced you to turn the page. Literally make them page turners.
The wildcat was too quick for Dick, and in a twinkle, youth and beast were down on the ground together. The wildcat trying to reach the boy's throat with its cruel fangs.
At the end of every chapter, absolutely must end with a cliffhanger.
"Careful there!" shouted Mr. Strong warningly. "There are too many of you!" But ere he had finished, there came another loud cracking, and the ice went down, plunging a dozen lads into the icy water below.
You must want to pick up that book again. And at the end of every book, you must be reminded that there are other books in the series and there were to be other adventures.
With the Syndicate underway, Stratemeyer's series began smashing sales records, leaving a trail of competitors in their wake. Fortune magazine proclaimed, "As oil had its Rockefeller, literature had its Stratemeyer." With every gushing success, Stratemeyer only sped up more. He began offering syrupy gumdrops like Bunny Brown and the Bobbsey Twins to a budding kindergarten set. Headlines and pop culture remained a constant source of new series. Bomba the Jungle Boy aped on Tarzan, and the Ted Scott Flying series landed on shelves just as Lindbergh's Prop stopped spinning in Paris.
He had many, many ideas, and he never really knew which one would take off and which one wouldn't. He would throw these ideas out, and the ones that worked, he would broaden the idea and crank up the publishing program. And the ones that didn't work, he would quickly fold.
But sales figures were not the sole meter for success. Stratemeyer poured over bag after bag of fan mail, using the letters to keep pulse with his readers and tailor his books to their fancy.
"Dear, dear Mr. Appleton, I cannot express the joy I get out of your books, but please do not have Tom marry, because I want Tom to be an inventor."
Dear sir, I am a great admirer of your Don Sturdy books, even if I am a girl. My brother has the whole series.
Dear Laura Lee Hope, please, when you write the books, make them very, very thick, because I don't like to get through with them. P.S. Please have Freddie do a lot of getting into mischief and running away with Flossie.
One of the things that really impressed me is that Stratemeyer wrote personal responses to every child, and they weren't form letters. They will say things like, Miss Laura Lee Hope thanks Jane Doe for her nice letter about the Bobbsey twins.
And ever the salesman, Stratemeyer never missed a chance to also plug his books.
My dear young friend, I thank you for your kind words about my books and trust you will find them as instructive as you appear to find them entertaining. Under separate cover, I mail you a catalog of my books.
So he was a very good promoter, but I think he did it not necessarily to make the money, but because he thought people enjoyed his books.
And while many did enjoy his books, many also did not. Parents, educators, especially librarians.
Those adults that we might term cultural gatekeepers wanted children to be edified by what they read and made better by what they read, and to that extent, their goals were in accord with Edward Stratemeyer's. What they objected to was the sensationalism, the lack of literary quality, and the implausibility of many of the plots.
Stratemeyer's most vehement critic was Franklin K. Matthews, chief librarian for the Boy Scouts of America. In his article, Blowing Out the Boys' Brains, Matthews claims,
Boys who read such books find their imaginations are literally blown out, and they go through life as terribly crippled as though by some explosion they had lost a hand or foot.
Stratemeyer considered suing. The problem? He couldn't prove damages. Despite all the criticism, his series were selling over 4 million copies a year.
I think Stratemeyer's books, with their sort of unabashed interest in adventure, not caring too much whether it made a lot of logical sense, appealed to children. They didn't worry about the logical sense either.
Stratemeyer knew kids wanted easy writing, with thrills and spills and comfortable characters they could identify with. In 1927, he really gave it to them, in the form of teenage crime-busting duo, the Hardy Boys. In Frank and Joe's world, trouble was always knocking at the door. Or, as in The Clue of the Broken Blade, it just walks right in.
I have reason to believe that one of the biggest groups in crime is operating under our very noses, Fenton Hardy burst forth. You mean right here in Bayport, Dad? Joe exclaimed.
For readers wondering just why they so love the Hardy Boys, Stratemeyer pinpoints the answer.
Because Frank and Joe are fellows like yourself. They like action, plenty of it. Just leave a mystery around, and they'll be in it before you can say, Sherlock Holmes.
Children like to unravel things. They're unraveling mysteries of their own. The whole world is a mystery to them. Their identities, especially in adolescence, are mysterious to them. They're in the process of finding who they are. That's why I think the plots in the Stratemeyer books appeal to people that look in the mirror and maybe are dissatisfied with themselves in their lumpy 12-year-oldness to think that, I'm really a talented detective underneath.
With the Hardys, Stratemeyer gave his formula a new twist. Beyond their talents as crackerjack detectives, he turned Frank and Joe into never-aging heroes. They would live on as teenagers forever, and young readers would be able to enjoy an endless supply of the Hardys' solvable mysteries and their inevitable happy endings.
It doesn't matter how many cliffs they were swept over, waterfalls or thunderstorms or whatever kind of horrible adventures menaced the boys. There was a kind of comforting sense that they would return.
By 1930, the syndicate juggernaut was cranking out 6 new series books a month, while the Stratemeyer formula had become an industry-wide standard. But despite his pantheon of fantastic characters, Stratemeyer had still yet to offer young girls a hero they could truly identify with.
In his earlier girls' books, they didn't have anywhere like the kind of adventures that the boys did.
At the time, it was not generally thought that girls aspired to things other than being married and having children. But Edward Stratemeyer had an almost extrasensory idea of what was to come, and he felt that the world was ready for an independent girl.
And in April of 1930, under the pseudonym Carolyn Keene, Stratemeyer debuted his latest brainchild, a plucky 16-year-old girl who drove straight into the pages of the most successful and longest-running series book in publishing history.
"I am Nancy Drew," said the girl. "I know you are Nancy Drew," mimicked the stranger. "I've seen you go flibberty-gibbet in your auto many a time. When I was a girl, girls stayed home and learned to cook and sew and mind their own business. I declare I don't know what the world is coming to."
For young readers, too, Nancy was like nothing they'd ever seen. Competent, dignified, liberated. Stratemeyer had not only delivered a heroine his children's children could look up to, he'd tapped straight into the hearts of millions of adolescent girls.
On the one hand, no real person could possibly identify with Nancy Drew. She's superhuman. But that doesn't stop us from writing ourselves into the character. When I was a kid, it never occurred to me that Nancy Drew was an unrealistic portrayal of anything. I firmly believed that when I turned 16, I was going to have a boyfriend, a roadster, and somebody was going to drive past my house, throw a rock through the window with a note tied around it that said, "Keep off the case or else." And I would be off into the pages of my own Nancy Drew mystery. And she gave me the tools to imagine that.
Nancy's arrival was a seminal moment in children's literature. But unlike his timeless, ageless heroes, Stratemeyer never lived to see it.
The Nancy Drew story for Edward Stratemeyer is just a little bit sad. He presented the idea to Grosset and Dunlap. The idea was enthusiastically accepted, although it was risky for the time, and then really quite promptly died.
At Edward Stratemeyer's death, he never expected his syndicate to continue. Although his family helped him with plots and reading manuscripts, the hours that he put in to produce the outlines, edit the manuscripts, do the publicity that was required, all the letters, I think he just didn't imagine that anyone could do what he did.
But the footing of Stratemeyer's mighty syndicate was not so easily toppled. Within just months of his passing, Stratemeyer's eldest daughter, Harriet, grabbed up the reins. Backed by the ghostwriters and a trusty bag of pen names, Harriet seamlessly and invisibly propelled her father's creations on for another 5 decades.
I think it can easily be said that were it not for Harriet actually managing the Stratemeyer syndicate, updating and paying attention to each and every one of the properties, they would have faded away into history.
Fast forward to the Stratemeyer Syndicate and a new millennium. Under the stewardship of Stratemeyer's publishers, the whole gang is still here, but they're a bit different. Nancy does her sleuthing in cyberspace. Tom's designing micro-radiation DNA scanners. And Frank and Joe are busting terrorist rappers for a living. Celebrating their 75th, 16th birthdays, Stratemeyer's heroes remain as some of the most endearing and enduring fictional characters ever created.
They are the personification of what childhood should be about, which is irresponsible and fun and exciting and full of imagination. And I don't think that will ever disappear, so perhaps there will always be a place for these books.
Labeled the father of the series book, Stratemeyer was said to have written the first of it, the best of it, the worst of it, and the most of it. And though his name is still largely unknown, there are tributes to him everywhere. From the roar of a space shuttle designed by a scientist with a love of Tom Swift, to the hush of the library whose shelves are stocked with Stratemeyer books, enticing another generation of young readers.
"I'll always prize this clock," Nancy said. "A pleasant reminder of a thrilling adventure. And who knows, perhaps as a promise for the future." And as she looked down at the timepiece, Nancy seemed to know that exciting days were soon to come.